Okay, now I'm going to go over a little bit of work I've been doing, and this is not, I don't want to embarrass myself on this, but no, I'm going to go over some work that I've been doing with something called rotoscoping and using different AI tools to try to achieve rotoscoping, which is a artistic technique that is used in animation, but it can be used to process things like video. And so this is something that is kind of a hard problem to achieve and takes a lot of computational power. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to run it locally. So I'm trying to rotoscope on a local machine. I'm trying to rotoscope for maybe processing video or maybe creating artistic um, objects, artifacts. And so as it turns out, rotoscoping is, this is something that people can do by hand, but it's extremely time consuming. It's shown up in movies, and of course with visual effects, it's very expensive, very time intensive, and it costs like computational power. So I'm going to be, the things that I'm doing with this, I'm going to be doing on a Mac Mini, or I've been doing them on a Mac Mini, like an M4 Mac Mini. So this is something that's, I think, well, I don't know. Now there's a run on Mac Mini, so I don't know if you can get your hands on one. But if you can, this is something you can do on a local machine. So rotoscoping is where we take an image and we want to animate things from a set of moving images. So this is Tom Cruise in a movie where he's talking on the phone, and the idea is you draw out each frame, you trace it out, you make a drawing, and then you animate those drawings so that they form this, motion. They embody motion. And you can do a lot of things using rotoscoping. You can remove backgrounds. You can segment out features, obviously. And you can also mask a moving image. This is on the right, this is an image of a moving cat. It's walking along the ground. I haven't done this, but I got this from the internet. Segmented out the background, segmented out the front ground. So the foreground is now just kind of one color. It's preserving the motion, at least in the extremities, and you're able to identify that as motion of a cat walking. So you're segmenting out parts of things. You're removing the background. You're also able to mask a moving image, so you can mask everything and then use that general mask across frames to convey motion. And so those are kinds of things you need rotoscoping. You can imagine like you can use this for movies. This has been used if you've watched the movie A Scanner Darkly um, with Keanu Reeves. This is where they rotoscope the entire movie. The whole thing is done in rotoscoping. So they shoot the movie and then they do the animations on top. So this is the technique that we're interested in. And this is very difficult because, it requires and up until recently, it's required a lot of, computational power. It's a tricky technique. And so, how do we do this sort of cleanly, maybe effectively, and maybe something that's affordable? Because there are a lot of tools that have rotoscoping in them, but the tools cost a lot of money. So there are a number of tools like professional videographer tools or video processing tools that have a rotoscoping feature in them. But for one thing, they're not necessarily always very good. Or another thing, that costs a lot of money to license and then to run. So actually, we can use the SAM2 model from Meta to do this. And so as it turns out, SAM2, we used SAM and SAM2 in DevoWorm to segment biological images. So to do things like segment out an embryo, and because the embryo is of course always moving around, we can acquire images from a microscopy stack, but we can also acquire images over time, and then we can animate that by segmenting out the background, segmenting the cell bodies, and then animating that, so we can see movement over time, and we can do things like build Lagrangian coherent structures, or we can build temporal graphs or other things like that. So, we can rotoscope things using machine learning models essentially. And SAM2 is Meta's segment anything model, so this is open source. So this is not something that you necessarily have to pay a licensing fee for. So again, SAM2 is good at this sort of video segmentation where it can remove features across frames. There are different proprietary methods like Adobe After Effects. They have a Roto brush tool. They have VFX Paint Studio, which is also another rotoscoping tool. But again, these are expensive. And you don't necessarily want to invest in one of these tools if you're not a professional videographer or you're a movie studio doing special effects. And so again, SAM2 can be used to segment features and track across frames using OpenCV and a variational autoencoder. So this is an example from a Scanner Darkly. This is Keanu Reeves' face, and this is the whole movie is like this, where they've taken video and they've masked things and they've segmented out the background and they've done all sorts of things to augment the movie, the motion of the movie, and we get this fine movie that is really interesting, visually compelling, and we can do this with other things. So we might take video where we, instead of having a green screen in back of us and projecting things on the green screen, we take a video and we segment out the background around a figure, around a person, and we put things in that background. And we can do that through rotoscoping. We can mask the background, we can take that out, and then we can put things in its place. And so it's a little bit different than this technique, or exactly how this technique is implemented, because you're not animating the person in the foreground. You're just doing things to the background. This is another example of rotoscoping where you're going from like a real image to an animation. And of course, this can be done by hand, but it's very time consuming, and you can do it with like professional video tools, but it's also very expensive. This is an article on the future of rotoscoping, AI automation, next-gen visual effects. So again, like I said, this has been used as a visual effects tool for probably 2 decades now. And it's great for if you're making a film with a several $1 million budget. But if you're trying to do this for, say, like a small business, or you're doing it for recreation, then it becomes much harder to justify doing. But it also opens up vistas for you in content creation, in a lot of modern video, not just filmmaking. We need to have visual effects. They can add on and become a core part of the storytelling. So we can do a lot of really interesting things with rotoscoping. And automating this process and making it cheaper and more accessible is, key to this. So rotoscoping, the process of tracing over or masking footage to isolate elements, that's the way they define rotoscoping here, has been essential in compositing, background replacement, wire removal, and countless visual effects tasks. Traditionally, it's been one of the most time-consuming and labor-intensive jobs in post-production. But now with AI automation and next-gen software, rotoscoping is undergoing a dramatic transformation. What once took days can now take minutes, and what was repetitive drudgery is turning into a hybrid process of human artistry and machine precision. So they used to do this by drawing things out frame by frame and then putting that all together in like a cartoon or some short film. Later on, you had these tools embedded in different packages where you would, put things in and the computer would render it, but there was a lot of kind of post-processing and pre-processing that needed to be done. It would take a long time, and it was expensive to do. So all these things, we want to reduce the cost, we want to reduce the time involved in doing this, we want to make it more accessible. So in this blog post, they're going to talk about how we might see this kind of be shaped in the future. So again, what is rotoscoping? They talk about how you can use it for wire removal and stunt scenes. You can use it in Star Wars. You can use it for like modeling lightsaber glows. So you have like, two people with sticks. Lightsabers aren't necessarily real. You could take two people fighting with sticks and you could render those as lightsabers where you have the sticks glowing and the sparks coming off of the sticks when they hit each other and things like that. So you can actually introduce visual elements. You can replace backgrounds, and green screens aren't perfect, or when you don't want to use a green screen for whatever reason. You can also do things like product replacements. This is where you're just, switching out elements in video, one thing for another. And then stylized effects like glowing outlines in music videos. So these are all things that we can do with these rotoscoping techniques. And so again, manual rotoscoping is sort of the old way of doing it. Right now we have semi-automation and smart tools. So again, like things like Roto Brush 2 and Silhouette FX, Mocha Pro. Foundry has some tools as well. And these allow you to do sort of limited rotoscoping and, but they're proprietary tools. And then, they don't eliminate the manual work. So you have to do some processing, but they do kind of give, like if you're a professional artist, they give you support. You can lean on them to speed up your job. But then the idea here is that we can move to a totally automated pipeline where, we can use computer vision and machine learning to automatically detect things and separate subjects from their backgrounds, for example. So you can do, what we might call computer vision and apply it to these sort of artistic tasks. So this is actually what SAM2 does. It takes, you basically do image segmentation, and then it tracks those things that you kind of define what the boundaries are in the first frame, and then it just kind of follows through and tries to predict for subsequent frames where that background should be. And it's going to take a while to kind of get that right, because of course, the background border between the foreground and the background is always changing in a video. Sometimes, you have a very clean boundary and sometimes you don't. So it's hard to do. And this is from me kind of working with it and getting some experience with it. So there are a lot of challenges to AI rotoscoping. There's hair and fur, which can confuse AI models because that's a very fine level of detail that's hard to sort of define. Sometimes if you manually trace it, even, it's hard for the algorithm to track that boundary sufficiently. There's also motion blur, where you get blur, and so the boundary becomes ambiguous with motion. You get lighting variations, which can force the algorithm to misidentify different things in the video, thinking that the foreground is background and vice versa. And then, if you're trying to tell a story or you're trying to get a certain sort of global outcome, machines can't do that work for you. You have to kind of guide the machine, or you have to kind of guide the algorithm through the entire video. So you just have to have the right tools, and you can do this easily, but you still have to be thoughtful and have a method for doing this. So more rotoscoping examples here, and this is our cat. This is, of course, mapping between a person moving around. So if I took a video of this person, I could map all their movements to this rotoscoped image where I'm just taking the foreground and I'm changing the shirt color and the pants color, and the background has trees and grass, and I can change the texture and color of those things too. So I can model the scene by segmenting out every feature in the scene and then replacing it with some artistic representation. So this is Rotoscoping Animation, a Comprehensive Guide, and it just kind of goes through the history of rotoscoping. So it was actually originally used in movies in the 1910s, and it really kind of took off with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That was a Walt Disney movie in 1937. That was all done manually, so this is not something that they had, they even had special effects software for at all at that point. Um, and then in the 1970s, we started to get a resurgence of this technique, which led us to sort of the more modern applications of this in the 2000s. And so, yes, this is definitely a thing that we would like to automate, but this is something also that is harder than it seems to do. So, also, if you're familiar with the video Take on Me by Aha, that was done completely in rotoscoped form. So it's like this music video that a lot of younger people probably have never seen. But if you go look it up on YouTube, you'll find it. And yeah, this is a good example of rotoscoping as well. And so in rotoscoping, you have to prepare your live footage. You have to import it into the software. You have to create masks, so you have to outline the areas to be rotoscoped. So, this is often kind of defining the boundaries of the objects that you want to, say, keep in the foreground or identifying the background and, masking that from images. You're not doing it from the video because you can't. You just have to do like one or more images, and then the algorithm has to interpolate all of that. Then you have to animate it by doing frame by frame tracing. And so, you can use keyframes to do those interpolations. But this is, again, something that is going to require a lot of fine tuning. Then refining the edges. So, of course, the edges are always a problem. It's always hard to get the edges just right. And you can end up with some pretty weird effects on the edges if you're not careful. Because a lot of times in videos, you'll be tracking some person, for example, and they're moving around or they're shifting just slightly, and the mask kind of slips and it just kind of cuts off things in weird ways. So it's not at all easy to do. And then, of course, we want to compose things. We want to combine the rotoscoped elements with other visual effects or backgrounds. So we want to maybe combine things across frames, but combine things within frames. So that's a little guide to that. The rotoscoping Wikipedia page kind of goes over the technique and how it was Edward Muybridge, when he produced his famous images of horses in motion, where he used what at the time was the new approach of capturing things on film. He would film these horses that were moving, and he could take this film and you could take it apart frame by frame, and we really learned a lot about how horses gallop and move around from those animations. So it's very interesting. Sometimes these new techniques open up doors to understanding things that we just kind of took for granted before. So it's really kind of interesting how, we think about, say, like science, and we think about ways to do science, and a lot of people don't think about animation as being a pathway into scientific inquiry, but it absolutely is. And so it is with image segmentation and rotoscoping as well. Now, like I said, we want to be able to implement this locally. So there is a tool, and this is an open source tool that is written for the Mac. It's called SammieROTO, and it's based on SAM2. So this is where we have a version of SAM2, a fork of SAM2 that is specialized for rotoscoping. It's called SammieROTO. And it takes a little bit of effort to install and run because you have to, of course, have the right amount of RAM, and you have to, basically, the more RAM, the better. Apple Silicon, you should be able to run this reasonably well. But the higher number of the chip, the better. And this allows you to sort of implement a lot of these techniques on an image. So, you can take a video clip, and you can't really take like a 2-hour movie. You really need to kind of think about things in terms of 30 seconds or a minute. Because, it's going to take a while for this thing to process. You're going to basically go in, pick a frame, segment out the edges, or segment out the features, and then run the algorithm across the video. And it's going to produce an output, of course, which may or may not be what you want. And you have to keep going back and refining it. And so you're going through the frames and you're trying to, apply this technique across frames, and you're using other techniques like keyframes to sort of link those together to guide the algorithm. And, but it's still, I think if you put some time into it, it still gives you a pretty decent result. It's really interesting the way this tool works. And then this is a little bit older tool called SmartRoto. And this is where this firm was developing a machine learning version of rotoscoping, and they did their work and they had some lessons learned from this. So this is an article I think is kind of the nice ending article because it tells us something about how people have received these kind of new tools and how they're using them. So again, using machine learning tools is, kind of reshaping industries, and art, artistic rendering is no different. And so that's why back in 2019, Foundry set out to on this project SmartRoto, accompanied by leading global visual effects company BNEG and the University of Bath. Project aimed to speed up the rotoscoping process, traditionally laborious and time-consuming. The idea was that artists would create a set of shapes and a small set of keyframes, and then SmartRoto, or this machine learning algorithm, would speed up the process by sending intermediate keyframes across the sequences. And so the project is not without its challenges, particularly as modern machine learning has shifted the focus from a machine-centric approach to a data-centric one. So the success and performance of the tool is almost entirely dependent on the quality, diversity, and size of this data set. So, you basically have this movie. Well, in SammieROTO, you have the advantage of having SAM2, which is a model that's been trained on all sorts of data. So it's seen a lot of things, as they say. And it segment anything is actually pretty good. You can do like text prompts and create images, or where you can create features from text prompts. You can segment out things just kind of by getting a general idea of their shape, and the algorithm kind of fits that to objects in the video or objects in the image. And so this point about data centric, we have the data training of the model underneath SammieROTO, but they're kind of starting from scratch here, so they have to train these models. And so this is really kind of where, the better the data you have on different types of features, the better, for your performance. So this is, again, they had to kind of set up a pipeline from scratch. They learned some lessons here. They said it's been a great learning experience. It always is. The principal learning is that rotoscoping is very hard, and that people are going to be involved, certainly for the foreseeable future. There are a lot of considerations in the rotoscoping process that need to be taken into account before starting out on a project like SmartRoto. For example, artists don't necessarily put all the vertices and edges of shapes along corresponding image features and edges. They may just decide to put the middle of the shape elsewhere, resulting in varied edge cases that become harder to track. This is compounded by other difficult cases such as rotoscoping motion blurred objects and shapes being occluded during parts of their lifetime. Ultimately, this culminated in the realization that if you want to keep in line with artists, you need to work around how they work. So we've learned a lot more about how artists really work. So this is just kind of a, as a tool for artists, this is how we can basically improve things. So it's still a machine learning based tracking and shape consistency model. We're still imagining the user sets up their initial shapes and a few initial keyframes. And then with SmartRoto, we use this model to predict in-between keyframes better than interpolated or tracked keyframes to try to reduce the amount of time they spend having to finesse in the middle. And another thing here, of course, is computational effort. So if we have like something like an M4 Mac, it's something that has a decent amount of power with respect to doing kinds of things like visual special effects. Well, you still have to kind of think about running something like SAM2 locally and how much memory that will actually take to do a good job. So this is another thing that is, kind of a constraint on what we can do. I know from working from the video clips that I was working with, that is extremely hard to kind of get your head around, like how it, how the output is going to look if you say define a boundary in a certain way or you define a feature in a certain way. How is that going to translate across the video? And I'm not going to show any of the work that I produced because it wasn't very good, but I'm still playing with it, so I'm trying to figure out how to use it effectively. Okay, so they basically had this, they had to train their model. The data set included over 650,000 artist animated shapes consisting of 125 million user keyframes. So that's a lot of input data for this method. This is something that has to be, at least at some level, has to be imported into this tool. Like, if you don't have an underlying image processing model that's really good at picking out features, then you really have to have really good training data. And that means collecting data from instances of rotoscoping. So this is really that was a difficult thing to do, I imagine, is getting all the data that would be useful to training the model. And then, there's this question of, well, can SAM2 actually do rotoscoping really well? I know it can segment out image, like features in an image. It can segment backgrounds, perhaps. But then when you add this artistic level, if you're going to then use that for something at the other end, should you still use SAM2 for doing those things, or do you want to switch to another tool? You might use some other kind of generative tool, or you might then switch to some sort of artistic involvement, at sort of the manual level. So all sorts of things to think about in terms of the pipeline. So yeah, this is all kind of going over their lessons learned. So this is from 2019. So this is now 7 years old, and now we have SammieROTO, and that's an open source tool. So it's not like I don't know how much people are contributing to this project. I think there is some contribution here. This is the repo for SammieROTO. So this has 4 contributors. They have the organization, Zargzrax, you have 2 human contributors, and then you have Claude, of course. So it's written in Python, and here is the sort of some of the updates. So it just came out like towards the end of last year. It actually does support Windows and Linux, so you can use Windows and Linux, but you have to be mindful of the kind of computer you're running it on. I can only speak to the Mac application myself. So they acknowledge SAM2, EfficientTam, MatAnyone, and WAN2GP. So these are all things they're using in the platform, SAM2 being the most prominent.